All right, so this is an article written by Dr. Palmer in 2011. This was before he wrote The Science of Spirit Possession. This is after the Tao of Natural Cycles, but before the Science of Spirit Possession. And I wanted to read this for you guys because I think it'll be really relatable in that it shows where he came into this work at as a hypnotherapist, coming across these entities and needing a solution. So this will be a treat. So I want to read his little blurb he's got here. So keep in mind, this is 2011. This is Dr. Palmer. It says, following a career in business, my search for answers relating to the paranormal was initiated during a series of personal mystical experiences whilst living in the mountains of Crete in the early 90s, where I discovered my own gifts as a natural healer without any knowledge or explanation for these experiences. My quest for answers began with studying for a degree in psychology from Christ Church University College, where I learned the basics of scientific method. During the same period, I was granted a qualification as a hypnotherapist from the Proudfoot School of Hypnosis and Psychotherapy. After graduation, I began working as a hypnotherapist with referrals from a general practitioner. When I began to encounter patients with challenging symptoms and subjective experiences that did not respond to conventional clinical practice, this meant that I had to extend my search for explanations into areas beyond the conventions of mainstream psychology. I studied at Kent University for a master's degree in the study of mysticism and religious experience, where my dissertation was entitled Dissociation, Mystical and Clinical Perspectives. During these studies, I also trained as a spirit release practitioner with the Hickman Academy and the Spirit Release Foundation, where I learned how to treat those who were being adversely affected by discarnate spirit entities. I am currently researching the work of the 19th century co-founder of the Society for Psychical Research, F.W.H. Myers, for my PhD thesis, which provides the answers I was looking for many years ago. I am a member of the Society for Psychical Research, the International Society for the Study of Dissociation and Trauma, the Scientific and Medical Network, the Spirit Release Foundation, and the Royal Society of Medicine. Have written proposals to conduct research into the phenomenology of auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. And his PhD thesis was his book, The Science of Spirit Possession. So, let's back up here. Okay, like I said, this article was published in 2011 in the Paranthropology Journal of Anthropological Approaches to the Paranormal. And the article's title is Application of an Ethnographic Methodology for the Study of Spirit Possession by Terence J. Palmer. In my own doctoral thesis, I argued the case for a revised epistemology for spirit release therapy, according to the conceptual framework of F.W.H. Myers, the 19th century co-founder of the Society for Psychical Research. In my thesis, I support the adoption of the radical empiricism of William James, 1912, and a participant-observer method with anthropological research according to the model proposed by social science theorist Paul Dysing, 1971. Whilst my thesis was limited to examining Myers' conceptual framework, I was unable to examine in any great detail the participant-observer method, other than making brief references to some anthropologists such as Alberto Villoldo, 2005, who have applied it in their fieldwork on shamanism and soul loss. A central theme of my thesis is the proposition that personal experience of spirit possession is an essential factor in a revised epistemology that enables scientific inquiry to accommodate possession phenomena. This may seem to be a radical approach in the extreme, and one that would understandably be rejected by all but the most adventurous, or mad, researcher. However, This proposition is not as outlandish as it may at first appear, and in this article I apply in retrospect the ethnographic and methodology proposed by anthropologist Fiona Bowie, 2010, of the Afterlife Research Center at Bristol University, to two cases that I have encountered in my own clinical practice. The first case is one of possession where a client who was undergoing hypnosis for personal development became an instrument of communication for a discarnate entity. The second case is where I became possessed by a discarnate entity as part of my own experiential learning in how to direct earthbound souls to the light. There are very real difficulties in transcribing personal experience into a scientific framework, and this second case is representative of this difficulty. It was so difficult, in fact, that the only way I could report it was in the third person. Such was the intensity of the emotions experienced that even to this day I find it extremely difficult to convey the experience to others. This is the motive power of what Bowie would call the ethnographic method. Okay, whoops. Too far. All right. Are spirits real or imagined? A primary question raised by Frederick Myers in the late 19th century was whether man has a soul and whether it survives the death of the body. In my own thesis on Myers' work, I pose a related question. Do discarnate spirits have an ontological status, or are they the products of the creative imagination? If the possession hypothesis is to be upheld, there are certain assumptions and ontological factors that need to be established before the hypothesis can be tested. Should it be true that spirits influence the living, whether they are spirits of the dead, spirit guides, angels, demons, or elementals, that it implies that there must be a realm where the discarnate consciousness of spirit exists. If there is not a realm where the consciousness of spirit exists, then it can only be left to say that all notions of spirits or spirit realms are hallucinations or delusions created by the human imagination. And this is the prevailing view of the mainstream psychiatry. This view is challenged by the evidence presented by research conducted with spiritualist mediums, Swartz, 2002, and healers, Sitcher and Targ, 1998. Evidence is also revealed in the consulting rooms of practitioners of spirit release therapy, SRT, Baldwin, 1995, Crabtree, 1985, Fiore, 1987, Hickman, 1994, Modi, 1997, Nigeli Osjord, 1988, and Wickland, 1924. And it is in this area where spirits are released from the living under clinical conditions that Bowie's ethnographic method of cognitive and empathic involvement may have true value. Methodological parallelism. Whether there is a spirit realm that is on a continuum with our known physical universe according to Myers, or part of William James' pluralistic universe, or another dimension that is beyond our concept of space and time, it is a question that continues to reach into every debate about the nature or objective reality. Contemporary psychology has created for itself a methodological parallelism that appears to run along three parallels rather than two. Mainstream psychology is concerned with cognition and behaviors that are epiphenomenal. Parapsychology challenges the mainstream by attempting to produce theories to explain psi phenomena without discounting epiphenomenalism. It can be argued that psi research is really a black sheep of the mainstream because it needs to be accepted just as the infant psychology of the 19th century needed to be accepted by mainstream science. In complete contrast, however, is the research that recognizes the possibility that consciousness is fundamental and not produced by or dependent on a brain. This is the stance that Myers took, and it is the stance that some modern researchers, such as Russell Targ, 2004, and Charles Tart, 2000, have adopted in their search for theories to explain the nature of consciousness itself. A solution to the impasse created by psychology may be the ethnographic method proposed by anthropologist Fiona Bowie, 2010, which requires the researcher to engage with the object of study in cognitive empathic engagement. The hypnotized client. It was not my intention to investigate the ontological status of discarnate entities in my early career as a hypnotherapist trained in Ericksonian hypnotherapy. The therapeutic method involved helping a client solve a psychological or emotional problem by way of accessing their own hidden resources. The following is taken from my original unpublished account of the case of a young man who came to me for help with his self-confidence. As the young man was coming out of his trance, he made an observation that he experienced an odd sensation that someone else wanted to speak, someone other than himself. I asked him if he was willing to go back into trance in order that we may investigate this odd sensation and uncover its meaning. He agreed and re-entered his trance state. After a very few moments, he opened his eyes and looked at me. His entire countenance had changed from a shy young man to that of an older and wiser person. His physical features hadn't altered, only his expression and the gleam in his eyes. There was wisdom in his eyes. He introduced himself as Xing Pai, a Chinese scholar from the 14th century A.D. I was fascinated by this and engaged this person in conversation. His manner was polite and formal, but with a hint of friendliness. He thanked me for inviting him and suggested that we continue our conversation another time. After the client returned from his trance, he related his experience to me. He explained that he felt very restful and relaxed, and it seemed as if he were in a long corridor with someone at the other end who was speaking, although he couldn't quite make out what was being said. I conveyed to him the essence of what had taken place, and we agreed that the experience was both interesting and stimulating. We agreed to participate in further investigations. I had 2 or 3 more conversations with Xing Pai on matters of importance concerning the client's circumstances and those of others to whom I was providing therapy. All the time the client was in deep trance. We discussed things that concerns us, and I found the conversations most stimulating and rewarding. Then one night, Xing Pai asked if I minded and could he invite someone else to talk to me. I agreed as Xing Pai withdrew. The young man's countenance returned to that of a man in deep trance, as well as was usual. After a few short moments, he sat up and opened his eyes. Again his countenance changed, and I knew I was facing yet another person. This was different from Xing Pai, and looked at me with even greater wisdom coming from his eyes. He smiled a genuine smile and introduced himself as Lao Tzu. The name meant nothing to me, but I welcomed him with the same courtesy with which I had Xing Pai, and we entered into conversation. At the conclusion of that first conversation with Lao Tzu, he bade me farewell and referred to me as fellow traveler. Although I had no idea who he was, this address as fellow traveler gave me a sense of being honored. For several days the young man was pleased to accommodate my interest in the Chinese philosopher, whilst he remained in trance, and I had many opportunities to engage Lao Tzu in conversation late into the night. He began to offer advice on the book I was writing and suggested areas that could be expanded upon and that I should summarize each chapter. He knew exactly what I was writing and sometimes even offered very specific advice on points where I was having difficulty explaining myself. The information was valuable, to say the least, and I was given terrific insights to the workings of something that still didn't have a name. That was to come later. Having done all I could on the book at that time, I started college to qualify to go to university. One day in a class on counseling, the lecturer passed out some handouts that included a quote from Lao Tzu. I was astonished to find the name of the person I had been having conversations with here in print. I asked the lecturer who this Lao Tzu was. She replied that she didn't know. A fellow student said he knew and suggested I may like to borrow a book that he had in his possession. The next day he gave it to me. It was the Tao Tao Te Ching. My astonishment was complete. I love it. When I got home, the first thing I did was to ring my client and ask him to come over. When he arrived, I asked him, "Who is Lao Tzu?" He replied, "Isn't that the Chinaman you talk to when I'm in trance?" I said, "Yes, but who is he?" "Do you know who he is?" He replied that he had no idea. Then I showed him the book. The comment on the back cover stating that the Tao Te Ching was the most widely translated book, second only to the Bible, was the ultimate astonishment. We had no idea that the name of Lao Tzu was synonymous with one of history's wisest and greatest philosophers. To be honored in this way by such a great mind was indeed to be privileged. I asked him to go into trance and prepared myself to talk to Lao Tzu, but this time my apprehension was that of a schoolboy preparing to meet a head of state. As his trance came to its deepest, Lao Tzu emerged, and his expression spoke volumes. His eyes shone, and a smile occupied every muscle of the young man's face. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" I asked. He replied, "Is it not always better to discover things for yourself?" An observation worthy of comment is that most of the translators of the Tao Te Ching are skeptical of the authenticity of the work as being of the one man, and whether or not Lao Tzu actually existed. Well, needless to say, I have it on good authority that the man did exist, and still does, in a dimension that is connected in some way with our four-dimensional space-time continuum. The important element of this case is the fact that neither the client nor I had any prior knowledge of who Lao Tzu was. Secondly, the thoughts that were entering my mind as I was writing a monumental work of philosophy, whilst I was an uneducated layman, were being put there by a discarnate consciousness. The client was being possessed by the consciousness of Lao Tzu to the degree that he could speak by use of the host's brain, infrastructure, and body. In contrast, I was merely being influenced in my thoughts and ideas. This was my first experience of positive possession, invited, in the case of the client, and creative inspiration in my own subjective experience. Running Bear and the Heavenly Host. The next case is a result of a request from a client for me to help her deal with episodes of unexplained anger. She entered easily into trance, and I was confronted by the consciousness of a very angry man who wanted to kill. I did not know how to deal with this and took it upon myself to learn. I attended an experiential training course in spirit release methods, and the following account is from an unpublished autobiography written in the third person. Running Bear, medicine chief of the Blackfoot tribe of the Sioux Nation, stood before the host. For as far as his eyes could see were all the blue-coat soldiers and their generals, and all the medicine men, chiefs, and warriors who had perished in the Indian wars of North America. His rage consumed him, and he wept. He had been summoned to the light after 150 years of roaming the earth, bound by hatred in his quest for revenge. The light was all around. There was nothing but the light, the soldiers, and the warriors. A disembodied voice said, "It is time to forgive." The soldiers asked your forgiveness for what they did to you. Running Bear raised his hands in a gesture to embrace the host, and, with exasperation from the depths of his tortured soul, cried at the top of his voice, "And what about my people?" The disembodied voice spoke again. "They asked for forgiveness for what they did to all your people. They are sorry. They knew not what they were doing. They fought from fear, and they knew nothing of the right way. They are here now in the light, and they know, and they are sorry." "How can I forgive?" asked Running Bear. "So much suffering and so much waste. What was it all for? How can I forgive?" "They forgive you," said the voice. "Here in the light all is forgiven. You are here now with all others. We are all one. You have been separated from your brothers. Here we are all one. This is the great oneness. It is time. Say you forgive." Running Bear wept a grief for genocide, such a grief that no one man could bear alone, and he opened his mouth to express his awe. Such big medicine. He tried to put aside his anger, his rage, the rage of an entire nation who had suffered immeasurably at the hands of the ignorant, the greedy, the fearful, and the malicious, to one side, and he opened his mouth to speak words of forgiveness. It was hard, but he tried. I forgive. He wept again, and his body trembled. He fell to his knees, and he forgave. When he had recovered enough to speak again, he said through gritted teeth, "What was it all for? So much suffering. Are we to start all over again?" The disembodied voice said, "We are all one again. Your journey of separateness is over, and you have come home. Rest now and be at one with all your brothers, red and white, in forgiveness and universal love." The disembodied voice said, "Now, James, bring all of your consciousness back into yourself. Be centered and grounded, and come back to a full consciousness awareness in your own time." James returned to conscious awareness and found himself once again in the room with 9 other people. His body was still trembling from head to foot. His face was streaked with tears, and his hands were burning. As he unfolded his legs from the lotus position on the sofa and put his feet on the floor, one of his teachers sat in front of him and held his ankles to help ground him back into this material world. He had been to the light to help return a lost soul, the soul of Chief Running Bear of the Blackfoot tribe of the Sioux Nation. This is where his search for answers had led him. He was being trained as a spirit release practitioner by the UK division of the Hickman Academy for Depossession. James had previously thought that he had experienced anger, but never in his wildest dreams could he ever imagine such a rage could exist in the breast of a man. He asked his teachers and the rest of the class if he could excuse himself. He put on his shoes and coat and stepped outside into the gray drizzle of a January afternoon and walked a little. He found himself at the pub a short distance from the house, where the course was being held, and bought himself a large Scotch. Never before had he experienced such a powerful emotion, and he needed time to recover. In fact, it took James all of 2 weeks to recover properly. After the course had finished, he had gone back to work, but he would feel the pain of the experience for a long time to come. Each night for 2 weeks, he would experience with tears streaming down his face, in diminishing strength, the grief of genocide and the anger of Running Bear. But in parallel with the pain of the experience, he felt the peace of Running Bear's ritual of forgiveness. At last he had some real answers. If the ability to forgive had the power to overcome the grief and rage of genocide, then there was hope for the world after all. Forgiveness was the key. James's experience, in fact, the whole philosophy behind the experience, could still be irrelevant in relation to the real world in which he lived and worked. Was what he had experienced real, or was it just a figment of his imagination, or the result of a suggestion whilst in a hypnotic trance? Skepticism of the mystical is something the modern world of technology and medicine have taught us all, and James's own scientific training in psychology was still at the opposite end of the spectrum to his own spiritual healing powers. His faith in his powers and his faith in God had been shattered by his failure to help. But 2 weeks after the healing of Running Bear, James was attending his local spiritualist church, and the visiting medium came to him and said, "I have an Indian here for you. He is big and he wears a beautiful war bonnet. He is giving you his peace pipe and he is smiling. He says thank you." It was then that James knew that what he had experienced had been real. His own consciousness, his spirit self, had actually been in the mysterious light, and he had been a carrier of the spirit consciousness of Running Bear. He had rescued the chief and taken him home. James's faith in the mysterious workings of the mind of God had been restored, and he knew it was not a belief anymore, it was the knowing, and he was well on his way, going with the flow of the mysterious cycle that had began a 1.5 years earlier. This was a cycle that broke all boundaries, and he was beginning to understand. Possession experiences are life-changing and take the experiencer into realms that are beyond the intellect. Writing in a style that demands the objectivity of the detached observer is completely different from conveying the subjective reality of experience. And this is just one of the difficulties in presenting data from anthropological or psychological studies. I would argue that Bowie's method of cognitive and empathic engagement with the possession experience needs to be expressed as an emotive experience and should not be transcribed or translated into academic terminology. To do so would deprive the experience of its meaning and reduce it to a dry and meaningless mnemology. All right, that was a powerful story. Dr. Palmer's experiences. And I have to say, that's the first time I believe I've heard of the full story of the running bear experience. That's really cool. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Don't forget, if you need more information, Spirit Release Therapy, you can go to the Spirit Release Academy webpage. One of us would be happy to help. Thank you.